Hi, everybody. So today we are just going to touch a bit on understanding how to build human connection in the knowledge era. So if we can go to the next slide. So just to touch on what exactly I'm referring to, a journalist by the name of Elaine Jones highlights that people connect with people, right? We understand that it's a normal thing from a human perspective. And from today's perspective, brands must understand that they need to put their human face to build trust and loyalty. And this is something that has been in conversation for quite some time. But if we start to track in terms of the evolution of brand communication over the last 10 years, we see that there's different nuances that brands still need to start to grasp in terms of how do we better communicate with our audience online and ensure that we're coming across as human. We want to relate with people in a way that we don't sound robotic, we don't sound like an organization, and we can be part of the clique. And if we look in terms of the past 10 years, when we look at around 2012, 2013, it was the start of the brand activism movement where people were protesting against social injustice. The Black Lives Matter movement started picking up and gaining a lot of momentum. And it was then we started seeing brands taking a much bigger role in society, speaking against social injustice, putting their foot down and stating what exactly it is that they stand for and which sides they actually play on. And in the last 2 years, we've seen this collaborative efforts between brands and society, whereby we are encouraging people to flatten the curve, we are kumbayaring together from a short period of time in terms of the hard lockdown when we were all afraid and still understanding what COVID is. But now we need to have this conversation of what does this now mean for brands as we go back into some sense of normality? How do brands continue to try to start building human connection with their consumers? And when we look at it in terms of the next slide, we look at it how we break it up into two spaces. So from the first hand, we're looking at brand connection. How do brands use social media, tap onto certain nuances that continue to engage with consumers in a very natural, organic way? And then looking at it in terms of an African perspective and how organizations are actually bypassing infrastructure limitations and ensuring that the likes of e-commerce and digital connections still happens to be at the forefront within Africa. So when we're looking at a brand connection perspective, we see that we are touching on this aspect of pop culture, which we'll see on the next slide. And from a general perspective, we need to have an understanding that cultural moments and cultural points are quite pivotal in terms of how your consumers are engaging online. TikTok is a great example of how challenges have been catapulted and are no longer based on what generational fit you fall into, but anyone can engage in it. And even if you look at just at the examples of Wordle, which is a popular word game for those who do not know, and how Mercedes just essentially tapped into this. It's a simple post, but what it actually does, it shows consumers that this brand is actually engaged with what they are interested in, and they're also just taking part in conversation that their consumers are engaged in. So as brands, you need to be a little bit more intentional about keeping track of how your consumers are speaking online. What are they talking about? And how can you as a brand actually tap into this? Next slide. And then we move into this curated self. Now, this is a trend that we started seeing in 2019, where this aspect of showing a bit of reality online is actually something that is embraced, especially from an influencer perspective. 2020 and 2021 have really spoken a lot about this aspect of highlighting the realities that you face. So we've seen people who are mere influencers and specifically talking about emotional challenges that they're facing. We're seeing in terms of fitness spaces whereby your influencers are highlighting raw content where it's not filtered, they're pulling ugly faces as they're lifting weights. And now from just a general point of view, this aspect of the photo dump, where it is a culmination of different pictures that are not curated. They don't really have they're not telling any story, but they're just highlighting some of the real life content that people are facing. And it's quite an interesting notion because from a brand perspective, we are really focused on this aspect of having a timeline that is curated, content that is completely clean and filtered, and it really speaks to whatever it is that the brand is trying to say. But from a general perspective, in terms of engaging with consumers, in terms of being a little bit more human-like, have those elements. Play in the spaces where you're creating content that highlights a bit of the realities that you go through. Take part in something. Take part in photo dump or the take part in the photo dump or one of those, reality versus Instagram images. And this is something that we've also seen with Dove. The image that you're seeing right now is the American singer Lizzo. So she collaborated with Dove, and they mainly focusing on creating a campaign that speaks to body positivity online. And she actually refers to this notion of taking part in the selfie talk and encourages parents to actually speak to their children about this. And what this essentially means is that from a brand perspective, even in our campaigns, consider aspects of not filtering, consider aspects that highlight the realities and speak to some of the challenges that people face on a daily basis, just to become a lot more human and relatable. Next slide. And then this notion of screen-free engagement. And something that we're all aware of is that people are fatigued with being on their screens. But what is quite interesting is that from a South African perspective, you have a very big audience that listens to a lot of radio. I think I read an article that said there's about 8 million people listening to the radio on a daily basis. And what this essentially means is that there's a lot of opportunity for brands to start tapping into the audio trend. Now, you've probably heard about it in terms of the way different tech companies have been creating ways to engage with us in audio, but brands need to start thinking about how they can do this themselves. And what is so interesting is that you are now able to tap into consumers' daily routines without putting a product in their face, but starting to play around with the other different senses. So for example, Campbell, they created a package that people can actually use the QR code and actually get a playlist while they're cooking. So what you're essentially doing as a brand is that you understand the occasions in which your product appears in, but you also understand that you're not always going to necessarily appear in there. So how do you then play on other consumer senses to be part of the experience and to also be associated with the likes of cooking in a space that your consumer plays in? Next slide. And of course, digital personalization. Yes, it is still a thing. Yes, it is quite important. And yes, there is so much opportunity in this. And it's a really great challenge for brands to continuously stretch out what do they do with the data that they have? How do they meet their consumers at their points of needs, which we'll touch on a bit later. But also, how do you create something that is whimsical, that is fun, that is engaging for your consumers, touching on cultural nuances and playing in those spaces, but not necessarily having to punt out heavy content or just sending a personalized email. And something that Flying Fish did is quite interesting, and I think it's quite special. Firstly, because it's an alcohol brand, they created sneakers that were limited edition and that could be personalized. So what you're essentially doing is, on the one hand, as a brand, you are building up your consumer data. You're able to ask consumers certain questions, find out certain nuances that you'd like to hear from with your consumers, but then with the advantage of actually using that data to provide a greater and better service or experience for your consumers. And I actually had a conversation with one of my friends a few weeks ago, and he was telling me how he's been trying to cancel his contract with a network supplier. And when he called, they told him that, based on your track record, we actually see that the package that you have isn't really good for you because you don't use that much data. But let's rather provide you a plan B. And his thing was, had they contacted me 6 months ago because they knew when my contract was going to end and gave me a more personalized package, I probably would have stayed. And those are those nuances that brands that have consumer data need to be considerate of. Don't just keep the data, see how you can actually provide a better experience and engagement with your consumers. Next slide. So now we're moving into the mobile economy and really trying to understand, how do we see what brands are doing in bypassing the barriers and limitations of internet and providing e-commerce services for their consumers. Next slide. So Telecom is pretty much a platform that is obviously garnering connection for consumers by just simply allowing for people to be able to engage with each other. And what we've already started to see and are well aware of is that there's a huge demographic in Africa that really does not have traditional banking, and they don't fall into that stream. And what telecom companies have actually done is provided digital services that allows for them to actually provide additional financial services. So M-Pesa is a great example, but what we've seen with Vodapay and Airtel is that telecom communications companies are now moving into the space where they pretty much becoming the monopoly in Africa in terms of how the mobile economy is actually moving. And it's really great on the one hand because they're able to collect a lot of data from their consumers and actually provide additional greater services. And it's also a great learning from a brand perspective to look at the data that you have with your consumers, see if you can actually tap into certain pain points and ask those questions just from building on certain digital communication to see what other services you can provide. Next slide. So still speaking on this aspect of being able to meet your consumers at a point of need. So when we saw the Black Lives Matter movement in 2020, where a lot of brands had actually came up and spoken about how they support the movement and the stance that they were taking, a lot of the brands were actually challenged by consumers to say, how exactly are you as big businesses working with small businesses? How are you supporting small businesses? How are you promoting small businesses? And what is quite interesting is that we're starting to see this conversation and this interaction in terms of big businesses and the role they are intentionally playing to empower small businesses. Now, from the one hand, this could be from merely providing funding, which we saw from the likes of Telecom, who were giving out financial aid last year due to the unrest, or in the following year, in the previous year in 2020, they were actually giving financial assistance to small businesses that were affected by the pandemic. But even from a brand perspective, the likes of Bud Light in America, they had a hashtag Thursday night shout outs. And this campaign that they ran for the whole of 2021 was mainly focused on giving a shout out to Black owned restaurants in America. And it's just simply using your platform to empower small businesses. And Nicola had already mentioned it in this power of collaboration. And something from a brand perspective and a business perspective, regardless of what size you are, consider how you can actually work with small businesses in your area, build up an inclusive value chain that ensures that there's this element of collaboration and empowerment in terms of the communities that you work in to also connect and become a lot more, build that human connection with your consumers. And the last trend that we'll be looking at is super apps. So we are aware of WeChat in China, and it's essentially a platform. It's a singular platform. It's an app that you can get multiple services and offerings from. They're not always connected. So you can have one platform where you can either pay for a flight, you can book a movie ticket, you can buy your groceries. And we're starting to see that this aspect of super apps is moving quite a lot in the developing nations. And it's merely because of a few challenges that we face in developing nations. One, as much as we do have a mobile economy, a lot of the phones that are bought cannot have a lot of storage. So how do we then bypass ensuring that we're able to provide digital services for consumers, even though that they cannot have multiple apps on their cell phones? And over and above this, data is expensive. So what we're starting to see is this creation of super apps, and it's mainly stemming from three industries, which is quite interesting. So firstly, we're seeing it from financial institutions. Netbank is a great example, where we are using one platform to do our banking, but also buy other items as well. And then we're looking at e-hailing companies, which I really think is a great example of how data really meets meeting consumers' needs. So a company in Nigeria called GoZim, which is an e-hailing company, they mainly focus on motorcycles, picked up during the hard lockdown that consumers were actually requesting additional services in terms of delivering groceries, in terms of delivering other packages, something similar to what we have with Uber. And because of that, they have now expanded their platform to allow for grocery deliveries, to allow for consumers to actually make certain payments. And then we're also seeing it from a telecommunications perspective. From a South African point of view, we can think of Vodacom. But I think in a nutshell, what businesses need to do, especially those that are able to collect consumer data and have consumer data, is to think about how you can actually meet your consumer pain points. Ensure that when you are expanding on a service or you're providing a new service, you're actually using your data to guide you in terms of the direction that you need to go to ensure that you are actually meeting your consumers at your points of need. And that was a sweet and short, to the point presentation. That is all from me. Thank you so much for your time.